Good evening and welcome to the Jaymie Icke Show, the programme that highlights the problem, but unlike so many others, also brings you the solutions to said problem. And tonight's episode is no different. This evening we're going to be talking about childhood trauma and trauma in general. So many suffer with it. The stats are truly harrowing. And what I'm also interested in is how growing up with unresolved childhood trauma impacts the adults you become, and potentially the parents that you become. Are you destined to imprint your own trauma onto your kids? Not necessarily in a malicious way. If you don't simply deal with your own trauma yourself, are you destined to pass that pain downwards? Shortly, I'll be joined by highly regarded and respected trauma specialist Zoe Clews, who has a clinic in Harley Street in London. She's got a number of different therapists that work there who specialise in everything from confidence right up to relationship support, and she'll be joining me shortly to dive into this. But first, I've got some stats here to give you a bit of background into this subject. Now, ever since the pandemic, we've seen that the rise of mental health issues, particularly in the young, has been something that has been speaking about, even in the mainstream media. Mental health is something that wasn't really talked about 5 years ago, but now it's something that's quite openly discussed. And when you hear these numbers, you will see why. Suicide is the second leading cause of death for teenagers and young adults aged between 10 and 30 in the USA. 25%, that's a quarter of the population of 18 to 24-year-olds, have reported seriously considering suicide in the past month. 9% of high school students attempted suicide in the past year. This percentage is apparently highest among females. Now, those stats are truly terrifying for various reasons, but this is one I'm interested in. 18 to 24, when I look back at my life, 18 to 24 was some of the best years you had. You're becoming an adult for the first time, you're going out for the first time, you're socialising, you're generally leaving home and starting to set up your own life, you're starting to make your own friends, you're dating, all those sort of things. They're the golden years to an extent. I know many say the golden years are later in life, but for me, they're those early years. It's when you're young, it's when you're fit, you're healthy, you don't have too much responsibility, you're generally only thinking about yourself, not in a selfish way, but you're trying to figure out who you want to become and what you want to do with your life, what career you want, whether you want a family, any of that. Generally, people that go traveling and see the world do it in that period. So the idea that so many are spending that time in a state of anxiety, in a state of depression, in a state where they don't want to be alive anymore, just goes to show how massive this issue is and how the world that we live in is clearly not going in a positive direction, is it? Now, what I'm finding interesting, and I'm going to go through these numbers differently, this is increasing concerns of these since the pandemic and during it. In 2021, 43% of 18 to 29-year-olds experienced some form of depression, compared to 21% in 2019. 70% of 12 to 17-year-olds perceive that the COVID-19 pandemic negatively affected their mental health. Between 2019 and 2020, there was a 30% increase in emergency room visits for mental health reasons for kids between 12 and 17. So clearly the trend isn't a positive one. And the fact that just last week a story came out that said that the pandemic had no impact on mental health, didn't make people depressed, had no impact whatsoever, is actually terrifying. Teenage suicide rose, teenage depression rose, we all know that. But the fact they're trying to deny it goes to show there's something clearly sinister behind it rather than acknowledging the problem. Apparently, an estimated 46% of children experience trauma at some point in their young lives. Now, trauma for me is slightly different because trauma is subjective. It means something very different to different people. To some people, losing a family member or your parents getting divorced, let's say, for example, or moving around a lot, moving from a school where you had friends, whatever it is, at a young age, can be classed as some form of trauma. To other snowflakes, Costa not having the type of latte they want may be considered trauma. But in terms of childhood trauma, generally, because kids are less emotionally developed, they take things on quite heavily. And I think that unresolved childhood trauma is a massive reason for why we have a mental health crisis in the adult population in the world today as well. That's why we have so many people that are, I would say, overgrown children, to quote the saying Jordan Peterson uses, because they haven't dealt with problems they had growing up and they're just destined to repeat the same things and probably push it on to their own children. So tonight I want to talk about two things with Zoe. I want to talk about childhood trauma. If you know you are suffering with something as a result of experiences you had growing up, what's the roadmap to dealing with them? The next thing I want to look at is if you're a parent and if you've been through some form of trauma yourself and you're scared that you're going to push that trauma onto your children, because most parents that do that don't do it through malevolence, don't do it for aggressive, malicious reasons. Many just haven't dealt with their own issues, and therefore they don't have the wherewithal to not pass them on. So I want to get into those two topics because I think they're things that everyone needs to understand and everyone needs to talk about. Because mental health is not just a buzzword. You can be fit, you can be lean, you can have the best diet in the world. But if mentally you're not in a happy place, you're not going to be the best version of yourself. People around you aren't going to get the best version of you, and you're not going to be happy and fulfilled. It's as simple as that. I had a good chat with tonight's guest on the phone last week, and she said a saying which really resonated with me, which is, if you don't heal yourself, then you're destined to bleed all over others. And that's something that we're seeing the world over. Generally, the most aggressive, the most narcissistic, the most nasty of people are the most hurt, damaged, and in pain. And they use that as a facade to cover it. Really, as we all know, the bully is usually just a coward, or a narcissist is just a fully grown bully. And tonight we're going to talk a bit about narcissism as well, because that's something that's definitely on the rise.